Welcome to Libeth. I'm glad you're here. This week we are in late Heian, Japan, with the Heike Monogatari, written by anonymous performers and later compiled by the blind monk Kakuichi. The Heike Monogatari is not a single line of plotting that carries you from beginning to end. It is an episodic pile of moments that accumulate pressure until something must give. Rather than a continuous arc with one controlling viewpoint, the work strings together scenes that each register a kind of fall, small collapses, public humiliations, sudden deaths, ruined temples, and lets their repetition do the heavy lifting. Instead of suspense about what will happen next, the narrative builds weight by gathering these collapses, and each collapse presses against the next until a pattern becomes visible. The effect is not so much sequence as sediment. Every episode drops another layer of meaning, and that layered structure transforms isolated misfortunes into a single design. The prose and performance form refuse linear surprise and choose, instead, a cumulative inevitability. That cumulative shape depends on a rhythm the text repeats with mechanical clarity. Rise, excess, omen, fall, lament. A figure or faction moves upward through success and ceremony. That ascent swells into excess that strains social norms. Signs, dreams, bell tolls, prophetic poems, portents in the heavens appear as commentary. Collapse follows, and the chorus of lamentation gathers the moral residue. The book stages that rhythm at every scale. A lord gains rank and marries his daughters into the court. His household accumulates new palaces and treasures. Somewhere a monk hears a prophecy. Then some movement shatters the household, and the narrative gives you grief in close, plaintive detail. The pattern repeats on the scale of a single episode, a campaign, and the entire age. The repetition makes the rhythm familiar to the listener or reader, so that the arrival at the lament registers less as surprise and more as the expected cadence of the tale. Inevitability in the Heike arrives less by explicit prediction than by the relentlessness of foreshadowing and refrain. The book opens with the sound of bells, the Jinshoja bells, and that sound never merely decorates. It returns as a structural voice that folds the entire accumulation into a single judgment, transience. Whenever the narrative pauses to note a ritual, a gift, a new title, a lavish ceremony, it also drops a line that frames the act as provisional, as if a bell is tolling on the very instant of triumph. Rather than surprise, the text offers a series of hints that, when concatenated, function like a machine set to a single outcome. Dreams recorded in the narrative take on the authority of fate. A poem composed in a moment of joy reads like the inscription on a tombstone. Repetition of images, bells, dew, floating foam, falling leaves, does more than ornament. These motifs work like nails driven at regular intervals. Each image pins the present to a future collapse, and the narrator tightens the tension by repeating the same nails in different places until the whole structure surrenders to the weight of what has been hung upon it. The book uses particular episodes as logic makers rather than as isolated drama, so a moment such as a highborn marriage functions as case law. When a warrior's daughter becomes imperial consort, the scene does not primarily dramatize affection or dynastic maneuvering. Rather, it consumes an entire theological and moral economy and demonstrates how privilege calls for retribution in the narrative's logic. The text layers ritual detail, incense, robes, the placement of a child near the emperor, with immediate moral commentary that reframes the event. The marriage stops being a marriage and becomes evidence of imbalance. Imbalance requires correction. Correction will follow. The narrative treats such events as nodes in a moral arithmetic, where acts of arrogance enlarge the debt that must be paid. This arithmetic is not strategic realism. It does not ask whether a marriage strengthens military alliances or reallocates landholdings. It treats human action as morally consequential in a system that reads the world as governed by causality of a karmic kind. Each episode functions as proof, and the proofs accumulate until no plausible alternative to downfall remains. What the Heike leaves out sharpens that inevitability because absence configures focus. The narrative does not give us the life of the rice field, the voice of the market vendor, the detail of debt that shapes peasant existence. Instead, it concentrates on palaces, temples, the etiquette of court, and the actions of those who hold visible symbols of power. The result is an elite lens that naturalizes the moral economy in which prestige and its loss are the only currency that matters. This absence is not accidental. By narrowing attention to those who can be publicly shamed, the story universalizes impermanence into a lesson performed before a trophy case rather than a social account of suffering. The losses we see become emblematic in the book's moral grammar because we are shown the trophies and their destruction. The everyday costs of violence and displacement remain offstage. That absence stops the narrative from branching into social reconstruction and keeps its arc locked on moral cancellation rather than material aftermath. Because the Heike reads events through a moral causal lens, the whole logic of agency changes. Decisions do not appear as moves on a board of politics, but as moral choices that create karmic pressure. Pride becomes a kind of misstep with metaphysical consequences. Greed registers as a transgression that migrates from private vice to public doom. The book describes tactics and battles with detail when necessary, but it always translates those particulars into a moral ledger. Military vicissitudes take on moral color. Victory without humility is a hollow victory because it seeds future ruin. Cruelty begets humiliation because moral law will find its balance. This interpretive move flattens contingency into necessity. Where a modern strategic history would interrogate logistics, supply lines, alliances, and political miscalculation, the Heike refracts every such element through ethical causality. This creates a narrative where the mechanisms of causation are moral rather than mechanical. So the appearance of collapse feels like the activation of a law already written, not the surprise twist of misfortune. The structure borrows also from the performance traditions that carried it. The Heike was not only read, it was sung by blind biwa players whose refrains and repeated cadences shaped how people remembered episodes. Those performers relied on formulaic openings and reprises, and those repetitions entered the text as structural devices that prime the listener to expect recurrence rather than novelty. A listener who has heard the refrain about impermanence will take any scene of triumph as a setup for its opposite. Instead of suspense, performance cultivates a practiced attention. You watch the architecture of a rise, and you hear the instrument tuning for the fall. The text encodes that listening habit into prose by doubling down on refrains and parallel scenes. The result is a narrative that behaves like a liturgy of decline, where each performed stanza reframes previous stanzas and tightens the moral not rather than loosening it. Consider how the arc of ascent functions as a structural fulcrum. The narrative never treats a promotion or accumulation of honor as a closed achievement. Each rise becomes an index of exposure, and thus an invitation to scrutiny. A lord's accumulation of palaces, gifts, and marriages is described with the materiality that makes the display unmistakable. And the same passage will include indicators that the same display unsettles social order. The text turns triumph into a structural vulnerability by showing the social elasticity stretched thin, alliances that depend upon favor, households held together by ostentation, religious donations that buy legitimacy, but do not buy devotion. This formal move converts success into a visible debt. The narrative logic requires that, when the strain reaches a tipping point, the fall will not simply be a mishap, but a settlement of the moral account. That settlement reads as inevitable, because the text has built the ledger out of the very acts it describes. As ascent produces isolation, the narrative intensifies its architecture of collapse. The Taira, as the text frames them, become insulated in successive scenes. They erect palaces in new ports, they cluster power within a family, they cultivate the court while alienating regional actors. The book renders that insulation with ritual and spatial detail, court processions, exclusive ceremonies, the funerary pomp of temples, so that isolation appears as consequence rather than accident. The narrative treats social withdrawal as both cause and symptom of decline. The more the elite withdraws into its own architecture of prestige, the less it can absorb dissent or decentralize power when needed. In the Heike's grammar, then, isolation is not simply a strategic misstep, but the moral outcome of excessive self-regard. And the text uses that framing to argue that collapse at larger scale will follow the pattern we already see in small social ruptures. That fragmentation becomes the engine of the Genpei War's depiction, where the book refuses a neat, unified battlefield drama and prefers dispersed, episodic violence. Rather than a single climactic confrontation, the narrative scatters defeats into many smaller scenes: river crossings, ambushes, isolated suicides, betrayals, and last stands. Each episode registers a fissure in the social fabric and supplies another stitch in the overall scene that will finally split. Because each scene mimics the same rise excess omen fall lament cadence, the proliferation of episodes does not add surprise, but pressure. Fragmentation turns the narrative into a network of moral proofs. Every local collapse corroborates the thesis that power built on vanity unravels everywhere. The book's episodic treatment thus performs collapse as distributed failure rather than centrally caused catastrophe, and that diffusion locks the reader into a sense of unstoppable decline. At the end, the Dan-no-ura episode performs annihilation more symbolically than strategically. The sea becomes the page on which the narrative writes ontological closure. The loss there is not only the defeat of troops, but the disappearance of ritual anchors and symbols that define the polity, the drowning of a child emperor, the scattering of sacred items, the publicness of the ocean as witness. Since the Heike invests such objects with meaning, their loss reads as an ontological erasure that cannot be redressed by mere political reorganization. The sea swallows more than bodies. It swallows the tokens that made rule recognizable. The narrative treats that swallowing as the natural terminus for a logic that has been running since the earliest bell toll. And by staging annihilation in ritual terms, the book concludes its argument about what happens when political form loses moral legitimacy. Why, then, does the text stop where it does, with the survival of memory rather than the survival of power? The reason lies in the book's work as a moral ledger, and as a performance designed to teach. The Heike does not aim to offer a manual for rebuilding society or to chart the slow, bureaucratic adaptations that restored order. It intends to convert political catastrophe into a mnemonic and moral artifact. Its ending shifts emphasis from material governance to story. What remains is narrative, lament, song, and the rituals that keep the memory alive. The last images are not strategy or reconstruction, but recitation and lamentation. That choice makes the closing logically coherent within the text's internal economy. If the point of the work is to show how pride collapses under moral law, then the durable thing should be the story that teaches the rule, not the political structures that failed to respect it. The tale stops when its moral lesson has been enacted in full and is preserved in song. Its termination is therefore a didactic endpoint, not a transitional moment in history. Seen this way, the Heike's construction removes the possibility of surprise and replaces it with inevitability. The episodic method, the rise excess omen fall lament rhythm, the pervasive foreshadowing, the absences that close off alternative perspectives, and the moral causal logic together create a narrative machine that converts contingency into destiny. The listener learns to expect decline, because decline has been rehearsed in text and tune a dozen different ways. The book's power comes from that deliberate refusal to chase unpredictability. It makes meaning by insisting that events align with a moral arithmetic, and it uses repetition, ritual, and the loss of symbolic anchors to turn historical happenings into a single, inexorable lesson. The triumph of that design is not that it explains every particular twist, but that it forces each particular to read as confirmation of the whole. If you carry that insight forward, you begin to see the Heike not as a failing in historical imagination, but as a calculated form. The book chooses moral inevitability over strategic contingency, because its aesthetic and ethical aims demand closure in memory rather than open-ended political narration. By doing so, it explains why its episodes feel less like points on a map than like arguments in a court of conscience. The narrative's episodic accumulation, its refrains, and its omission of the ordinary together make the defeat not merely a fact to be recorded, but a fate to be recognized, rehearsed, and transmitted. That is the architecture that shapes every image of rise and ruin in the text, and it explains why, when the last bell tolls, the story preserves grief rather than power. That's all for today on Libeth. If you want to follow the whole journey, subscribe, a new book every week.